So hopefully we have got some people listening to two Paulas talk about theatre, which I think is a podcast title, or maybe it's a sitcom, I don't know. So my name is Paula van Hagen. I'm the director of Chats Palace in London, and talking to me is Paula McFetridge. Have I pronounced that right, Paula? Yeah. Who's artistic director of Kabosh in Belfast. And we're just going to chat for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to take some questions. So if you're listening to this and you've got some burning questions, just type them in and they'll come up on our chat, and we'll deal with them at the end in the order in which they come. And we'll talk until we run out of interesting things to say, or we need a drink, whichever comes first. So great. I mean, you know, I did quite a lot of reading about Kabosh. I mean, you're a fascinating theatre, and I think it's quite an interesting kind of just potted history. Belfast, Northern Ireland, founded in 1994, which makes you guys a millennial, which is interesting. And I was very interested in how you describe your kind of twin strands of activity, which is theatre that transforms our understanding of who and where we are, and champions of new writing, but also animating new locations, which I thought was a very interesting combination of focus areas. And I love the way that quite a lot of what you talk about, you use the word provocative, challenging, innovative. What is Kabosh theatre DNA in less than 10 minutes? It's obviously going to be a ballpark, but for people out there who haven't heard of you and haven't seen your work, how do you describe yourself?
Well, I actually took over as artistic director in 2006. So
from the founder,
from the founder, Carl Wallace, who actually founded and actually ran the company for that period of time. And I took it over, I suppose, reconciled with the need to be constantly producing new work. So how do you produce new work while you're keeping the rest of your canon alive? But also what's important for us is how we evaluate that work. And we've taken a long time to develop an evaluation system that can articulate impact, because when you're doing this type of work, that's about social change and educating and inspiring and assisting with kind of new thoughts. How do you articulate that that's actually taken place? And so that's been a large part of the work as well.
And I noticed that a couple of reviews were talking about you as if, and using the word verbatim theatre, and that felt to me not quite right.
No, we don't do that. What happens is
it's interesting, isn't it? That mistake of understanding. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because you kind of get labelled with loads of different things. I've used different labels over the years. Like I was saying, like as regards to site-specific stuff. I mean, so many people would say to me, but you can't be site-specific if you revive it and you tour it, even though you're touring it in the same type of location, but it's in a different place. So that's why I find the kind of use of labels sometimes quite difficult. We don't do verbatim. All of the work is put through the lens of a professional playwright. So yes, the work is based on an element of truth or fact, whatever that means. And those words are difficult, but the playwright reimagines it in order to challenge the person who first owned the story or felt connected to the story, as well as those that would never engage with it. And I think that is an important dimension to our work.
Yeah, I agree. And verbatim theatre is a very particular tradition. It's very much about the literal words. Whereas actually what you're doing is taking the start as a starting point, personal history, and using it to create a work of drama that has a universality about it, while still retaining the elements of the specific, but not the names specific. So what you and I have agreed we're going to talk about tonight is just two little strands of what you do, because we can't possibly do the whole program of what your scope is. But we're going to talk about, I suppose, well, it's interesting, the legacy of conflict, and particularly Green and Blue, which should have been at Prague Fringe this year. And we're going to talk about theatre for social change. And I'd really, if we have time, I'd love to talk about the Lives in Translation piece, which was based on the experience of Somali immigrant women, which I think is also a very interesting strand in a perspective of what you do. But yeah, I mean, I think what was really interesting was what you were saying was where you start from and how you build something, and those three questions you ask yourself. Am I the right person to tell this story? Is this the right time to tell this story? And who is it for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think particularly when you're dealing with work that is of such volatile and sensitive material, you have to provide some sort of a framework for yourself where you assess how can you ask questions without re-traumatizing? How can you take care of both your audience and your artists? And so much of that is about trying to get the kind of timing for a conversation right. And right, I know, isn't the word I should be using. It's just when kind of tides collide, where there is a possibility of a story having a deep and meaningful engagement. And there's been so many occasions when I have considered telling a story and it just hasn't felt to be the right climate or the right context for it. And I think context is really important. Like, for example, with Green and Blue, it is a narrative that looks at the male behind the uniform, and it is about policing. And we would have quite a lot of work that that fits under the umbrella of the legacy of conflict work that we would do, but we had never looked at that story. There is a brilliant activist called Inez McCormick, who set up an organization called PPR, which is a Performance and Practice of Rights. And Inez always said that our job as activists is to ask who's not at the table. What is the narrative that's missing? And I try to consider that regularly about, like, when I look at the canon of work, whose voice is not there yet? Because I don't think it's possible for us to come to any sort of a reconciliation with the past unless all of the narratives have been considered and have actually been shared and potentially heard by those who don't own the narratives. And so I was very interested in this idea of how would you look at the person behind the uniform. I don't think as a proactive civic society that is inclusive, that you can have conversations if you don't have a police force that we can all believe in. And particularly when you're coming out of a conflict of the duration of ours in the north of Ireland, I think it's hugely important that we ask those difficult questions. So those stories need to be gathered. We do often actually, with all of our projects, is we work with a grassroots community-based organisation. And we worked with an organisation called Diversity Challenges. And they had created a project called Voices from the Vault, with the primary aim, funded by the St George Cross and by the Garda Síochána, which are the police force in the south of Ireland, to gather the stories of those who had worn the uniform, primarily male. And they were very interested in those that had patrolled the border during the height of the conflict. And so they gathered this archive. And what often happens with archives is they will sit in a resource, such as a university or a public records office, and people will access them if the story is theirs or they are studying it. What I'm interested in is, how do you humanize those stories to challenge somebody's perception of those stories and those people behind them? And Diversity Challenges, in their wisdom, decided that these narratives needed to be brought to a wider community in order to encourage change, whatever form that change may be. And they felt it was part of how we deal with the legacy of conflict in the north. And so they, in their wisdom, decided to put a tender out and save an artist to interpret the stories. Thankfully, Lawrence McKeown, a playwright who I've done a lot of work with, who is also a Republican ex-prisoner, secured the right to tell the story. And as I say, Kabosh and him have worked together quite a lot. And over a period of 2 years, we developed that play. Because what's really important is that when you create something that's based on an oral archive like that, even though it's not verbatim theatre, like, you're not going to stand up and say those stories per se, it's important you bring that community with you.
Oh, so, completely.
You know, like, that was key. And we knew that from the very beginning. Otherwise, that community would never have ownership of the project. And as I say, it's important to challenge that community as much as those that would never engage with the story. And so we, over a period of 2 years, we used to go into the room with this committee of current Royal Ulster Constabulary Police, new Police Service of Northern Ireland, ex-Garda Síochána, the police in the south. And we would do readings of the play as it was developing. We would have these open discussions. Some of them were very heated. And obviously, you have to manage expectations. Like you're saying, your stories are not going to appear as you told them to the archive, but also you have to build an element of trust where that community is prepared to be challenged, but also stay with you. And then as an artistic director, one of your priorities is, how do you secure the playwright's artistic integrity and independence? So how can you create that provocation and yet keep them all with you?
And keep the authenticity, because of course the play is set, it's 1994 the play is set, or 96, 94. So we're talking about history, but we're not talking about distant history. We're talking about very much living memory, and people, it will have been very fresh history for a lot of people.
Yes, yes. And also that the advantage of working with a community who own the stories and have personal recollection of it and have lived that story, that the authenticity they bring is down to the minutiae of how you carry it out.
Interesting. Yeah. And if you get a detail wrong, then somehow the whole thing becomes compromised. So the littlest detail and you've blown the whole thing. Yeah. How did you address that? How did you make sure you kept that, the authenticity of detail when you needed it? Yeah.
It was absolutely key. Now, obviously, I mean, you know, as any kind of theatre company knows, or like director knows, it's important you have a really brilliant team around you, you know. So I had a great set designer, Stuart Marshall, great costume designer, Liz Cullinan, brilliant film projection by Conan McIver. I had a great team with me. And so they wanted to also get the minutiae of it right. And so everything down to the buttons that were on the uniforms, the mint color of the shirt, getting the right clip-on ties, the right boots. And then obviously touring with guns is problematic.
Yeah, very.
So obviously then we had to work with the police, how the boys hold the guns. And it's interesting because I think if you don't work hard to get those elements as accurate as you can, then there will be members of the public that are delighted there's an excuse for them to dismiss the whole project.
Yes, because you got that one detail wrong, therefore the whole idea is compromised.
Yeah. And also, you know, it means an awful lot to those that have donated their stories, that the trust builds with them when they see how much effort you put into authenticizing what it was that they lived through. And then they're prepared to take a leap of faith with you and like allow you to humanize them, like reimagine what they lived through, and kind of mesh various stories together. And they would say that in the post-show discussions all the time. So yeah, I mean, it was 2 years, and even at that, obviously, you know, there are only a handful of us are lucky enough to have ever walked into a rehearsal room. And what happens in a rehearsal room, that chemistry that happens, that sets of play, something changes like massively in those 3, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. And so trying to explain as well that what's going to happen in there, and for them to trust us that what they will experience on the other side, and being able to share with them what theatre can do was incredible. And then watching them being proud to be ambassadors for the project. Now that wasn't where the issues with the community led, because obviously, or like stopped, because like inevitably that was only a small committee at the beginning. And then you still had to try and take it to those that weren't advocates of the project, were reticent about a playwright like Lawrence McKeown working on it, didn't feel it was the right time to tell the story. And so bizarrely, again, you know, that thing I said at the beginning, that's why you need to be ready to revive it. Like, we've been touring the show on and off since October 2016, and there are communities that we are bringing it to now, only now ready to engage with it.
And but 2019, reviving it in the world that we now have the word Brexit, must have been given it a whole additional kind of subtext, that because that wasn't there, this idea that there might be a hard border again, must be terribly distressing for a lot of people.
It is, yeah. I mean,
a fresh new context for the piece.
Yeah. Like, it's fascinating because obviously it always comes up in the discussions, like to say, like we always, and people desperately want to talk about it, but yet we still have people talking about personal memories of borders. You know, like we performed it in Dresden, it was fascinating listening to people talking about the whole, like whenever the Berlin Wall came down, and like their whole relationship with that, their relationship with uniforms. Like we performed it on an island off the south of Ireland, and again people were talking about that sense of being marginalised. So it is a catalyst for discussions on so many different levels, and yet yes, people always like would say to me, gosh, it's incredible that you thought to do this. Like, did you know Brexit was coming, you know?
Yes, if you had the power of knowing Brexit was coming, yes, you'd be magic. But I think this is the other interesting thing, and this is perhaps for people listening to this to understand, that when they come to see the play, they see the play, and then afterwards you have a discussion about what they've just seen.
Yeah.
Why do you do that? I mean, I can understand what I would get out of it, but creatively, what do you get out of that?
It's interestingly, because in a festival context, it's more difficult to do the post-show discussions because of the way the scheduling happens. And so I find it more bizarre not to do the post-show discussions.
Yeah.
I think it is important that people have the opportunity to air their response to the themes within the piece. People are desperate to talk, but also people want to know about what the reaction to the work has been in other communities. And that comes up all the time. And interestingly, we have the same conversations, whether it's for 20 RUC men in an Orange Hall, or whether it's for 325 people in Brussels. I mean, the same conversations happen. It's about their relationship with the uniform, their relationship with their own police, their understanding of borders, the idea of what it's like to live and be hunted, the idea of where is that female narrative within something like that. And it's and that's because Lawrence very effectively has humanized the person. And so the sense of connection is there. I have the discussions because I feel it's an important part of the work. I have a real sense of the responsibility of us as theatre people. If we're going to stimulate conversation, we need to be allowed to chair it, facilitate it, allow people to vent their anger, and also provide a support mechanism for those that need it post the event.
Yeah. And going from there, perhaps to talk about the other piece, is this idea of borders and people crossing borders and being marginalised within the border. Can you tell us a bit about that production? Because it sounds, and again, another one that would work in a very interesting way within an international context and a festival setting.
Yeah, Lies in Translation is written by a brilliant Belfast playwright called Rosemary Jenkins. And again, I've worked with Rosemary on several projects over the years. And again, what happened was we were looking at the canon of work as regards the narratives that were, I suppose, very lively in the North. And we felt we needed to open a debate about cultural diversity, about increased levels of racism. I mean, so many reports the world over talks about within a post-conflict setting, societies tend to fracture more. One of the unfortunate things in the north of Ireland was whenever we find peace, levels of racism quadrupled overnight. In the same way as, domestic violence, poverty levels, all of those, I suppose, social ills just started to rise quite significantly. And we felt it was important that we try to create a piece of theatre that tried to address that in some way. And so again, we've been working on it for a while. We tried to talk to some umbrella organisations that were offering support for recent migrants and recent refugees into the north of Ireland, because obviously with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, it was easier for people to come here. And so all of a sudden we did start to get an influx. And so there was a time so it felt like it was the right time to actually tell the narrative. Rosemary met with a support agency who introduced us to several Somali asylum seekers, brilliant women, and a particular woman who had been trapped in our system without even getting an interview to allow her to stay. She had been in our system for over 13 years. And so out of that, then Rosemary created a play. Similarly, it was the actual script that was performed was various stories intercut. So it's not one single person. It is not a repetitive theatre piece. And it is, we stage it in a fairly heightened theatrical form. So it allows for fact to sit alongside fiction. We worked with members of the Somali community, again, the designers. I worked with the same design team, funny enough, on this one as well. It was Conan and Stuart and Liz. Liz, the designer, worked with the Somali women, and they made all the costumes for us. The choreographer, Sandy Cuthbert, worked with the local Somali women to create, to actually restage dances from weddings. Our composer, Donald O'Connor, worked with a local Somali musician. Anyway, so all of those things brought it an authenticity from which was our springboard then to create something that was more, I suppose, a response to what it was that we were hearing.
And I think this is I think what the power of theatre is, that you can give a voice to these marginalised communities, marginalised women who've been there in the system for years and years, but because of their lack of official status, don't have the kind of sense of place and ownership of place and right to be there. And certainly, you know, there can't be a country in the world that doesn't have an immigrant population or has been built over waves of immigrant population. And you just have to look at the political upheaval in countries like this, like England, but also in America, to see how the minute you have any kind of disruption or repression, or the current situation we're in, and the fear of the other and the oppression of the weaker and the vulnerable becomes something where everyone just places their fear, their personal fear, onto the weaker in the society. So I think it is very interesting, this idea that you can have theatre with a distinctly civic role and a political role, but not in a party political role.
Mm-hmm. But it's also important that you see it as a means of empowering people.
Very much so, yeah.
Like whenever you're dealing with a subject like this, it is key that an audience leaves feeling active, feeling that they can create positive social change. Because I think,
exactly.
You know, that we can be so beaten down and so overwhelmed by the subject matter that none of us leaves the theatre space going, I now know a fact that I'm going to dispel a myth the next time I'm in a conversation, or I know what I can do to make a tiny bit of difference. And it's about how you then create a legacy out of a project. And Rosemary, particularly writing this, like we talked, and like some of the stories we heard were just horrific. And so it's not that you're censoring those stories, but it's that you're finding a way whereby you can share them, that an audience can actually retain the information and without feeling,
because you're dealing with real emotion, but you don't want that to suppress the impact. It's sometimes better to diffuse the pain into something that people can manage and reflect and consider. But I think it is very, this idea that, you know, this is kind of theatre that can change your community very much.
Yeah, and it's about survival. I mean, I think that's the other thing. We talk about
the triumph of survival. You know,
like it's very much about class politics. You know, it's about, you know, let's celebrate the human existence. Let's remind ourselves that with knowledge, with a voice, with an arena in which to share that voice, then we exist. You know, like that was key to it. You know, it's about, like, you know, for us it was bearing witness to those individuals that we met and doing it to the best of our ability. And interestingly, again, like so often in the post-show discussions, people would say, like, look around the audience and like say to us, oh, so where's all the Somali people? Like, it's a very white audience. To which I would say to them, this piece isn't for them.
No, they already know their story.
Yeah, I mean, they know the story. It's you that doesn't know the story.
It's everybody else. Yeah. What should we do? Because let's see, is anyone sending in questions? I don't think there are any questions yet. Let's have a look and see. Oh, someone's made a comment, Three's theatre company, saying our job as activists is to look around and see who's not at the table. And they really love that. So true and so beautifully put. Absolutely. Is there anyone else with a question? Please send it in. Otherwise, Paula and I are going to carry on talking, which we could do for quite a long time. Is there anything that you feel we haven't touched on in your kind of working methodology that you want to focus on and highlight? Or is there a new production that you're wanting to talk about?
Well, I think what's interesting is that so often when we deal with issues like this that are coming out of the community in which we live, we think it's a very parochial story. We think it's a story that is so off the context in which you live. And that idea of being honest to the context in which you find yourself and in which you're producing work. But what I'm amazed at is that the narrative of conflict and the narrative of dealing with the legacy of conflict is universal. And we have toured work to Rwanda, South Africa. We work with the British Council in Nigeria, and those communities and others are dealing with exactly the same issues, which is how do you humanize those you perceive to be your enemy? How do you move on from the past without walking all over the memory of a dead loved one? How do you ensure that you don't pass bitterness on to the next generation? How, by talking about the conflict and what you've lived through, you ensure that you don't re-traumatize. And also the idea that if you want to move on, do you have to forgive? And if you forgive, does that mean you're forgetting?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. The question of forgiveness. Where do you even start?
Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary to forgive?
Oh, no. I think we come to a point where there is, and acceptance is even the wrong word. Like, I think you get to a state where you can admit to the existence of something, and it takes a great strength to just draw a line under it. So
and to move on and rebuild. Yeah. But you need a society to do that, a community to do that as a whole, to collectively agree somehow, and somehow we manage it. There is a collective consensus that we're going to acknowledge it happened, and then we're going to move on and rebuild. And I do think that certainly in Northern Ireland that must be something that's happening. Do you feel that's happened recently, or is that something that's been an ongoing process, or where do you feel you are on that kind of the conflict?
I think we're still in the very early stages. I think the world would like to believe that we're further on than we are. I think that
we all would, wouldn't we?
But also I think that too often we kind of visualize success by the amount of cross community engagement that happens. And I think there are numerous conversations that need to happen still within a single identity setting that allows for those difficult conversations to happen. Like what we find with our work, we tend to do a lot of our work for an audience between the ages of about 50 and about 70, those who have lived through the conflict, who have suppressed the impact of the past and have spent the last numerous 20 odd years raising a family, trying to get a house, get a job, keep themselves sane on whatever level that is. And now there are numerous issues within there that needs to be given the opportunity to come out when those people are ready for it to come out.
Are ready to acknowledge it,
Because I think we're all at a very different timeline. I mean, it depends where you are, age, like it's back to context, like what age are you? Where are you geographically as regards your relationship to conflict?
Yeah, very much so.
And like whether you've had the means for informed conversations. I mean, I think we're still at the early stages. I think what's interesting is that the role of ex-combatants and community organizations and those that are and have been for a long time dealing with the legacy of conflict here, do incredible work at a grassroots level. It's interesting when you get that, from the ground up, rebuilding, and I think we do it very well. And I think, it'll just take time, I mean, like we had a conflict for 40 years, I mean, it doesn't just go away,
I mean, I think it is, and then just when you think you've moved along the timeline, something politically changes and it all comes back. And I think they're, particularly with issues like borders, but also with immigration, these are issues that are constant. We're never going to be able to move away from them because the pattern of Europe is very much the raising of borders and the breaking of borders, and before you know it, new ones come up, and not just nationalistic borders, but we're very much in a system now where cultural borders, poverty as a border. This idea that if you're poor, that's one of the biggest divides in terms of moving on and progression. Then you can get, and the divide between the richer and the poorer gets constantly wider and wider and wider. And you do wonder, and this idea, I suppose, every now and again a politician pops up and thinks of poverty as a choice, and poverty is never a choice. Poverty is never a choice.
And I think the impact of COVID is going to be huge.
Significantly.
Particularly when you're dealing with a fractured society like ours, and dealing with such levels of mental health. As has been said on numerous occasions, like we have lost more people through taking their own lives than we lost through the whole of the conflict.
Which is truly shocking, because obviously that mental health issue was always there. All this situation did was exacerbate a problem that was not being articulated and not being dealt with in a sufficient way, which is a lot to do with the money you put into mental health and the freedom to speak about it. We haven't got any more questions. People are obviously not feeling very questiony, but we've had lots of positive feedback saying how much people are enjoying the conversation. But let's kind of, I suppose my final question might be, because you're planning to bring the production to Prague, aren't you, at a future date?
Yeah, we'll be there, hopefully, all things being equal, we'll be there the 3rd week of October. The Department of Affairs are brilliantly supporting us to go out with it, so we'll be there. Great.
So what, I suppose that the encouragement for the audiences in Prague is to make sure they come along, but what is the experience going to be like for them? If people are now a bit concerned about what we've talked about, then actually it's going to be a traumatic experience. It's not going to be, is it? It's going to be a positive experience, and then they'll have the discussion afterwards where they can articulate what they feel, which I think is very important, so they will have a voice.
Yeah, I can 100% say it is an emotional roller coaster, but it is very, very funny, because it deals with the miscommunication between a police officer in the north of Ireland, police officer in the south of Ireland, and they're so close, but they are so poles apart. There's a bit of singing in it. There is, they do a whole sequence where they have to communicate in the radios, and not one bit do they understand each other. Audiences have loved it everywhere we've brought it. It is, it really works. The two actors, Vincent Higgins and James Doran, are superb in it, and they've been with us on this project from the very, very beginning, and their sense of ownership of it. In Edinburgh, we won the Lustrum Award. We got 5-star reviews. We were the top 18 shows from the stage. Like, we wouldn't be touring it for this length of time if it didn't speak to people. And it lasts an hour, so like, you're not in there for the night, and we'll happily see everybody for a beer in the bar afterwards and like have a chat about it. And it really makes you think. It lives with you for a long time. It's just one of those shows, and it's authentic. Like, you will not hear.
You won't forget it. No, you won't. And I think that's a really good note to finish on, I think, because I would encourage everybody who's going to be in Prague in October to make sure that they put Green and Blue on their see list, and probably quite earlier on, because they might want to come and see it again, and they certainly must leave time for the discussion afterwards and beer, because I think that will be a really interesting key point in the progression of the Fringe and the quality of the theatre that's going to be on offer in October, which is very exciting. So thank you for tonight, but thank you also for saying you're going to come in October. That's wonderful. And I think we'll wrap it up there.
And if anybody wants to know anything more about Kabosh, follow us on Twitter. We're just at Kabosh Theatre. It's very easy. Follow our website. You'll find a lot of articles about the work and stuff up there. And and if you have any questions, you can always get in touch with us via there, and we'll respond.
Great, lovely. Thank you from the two Paulas. And thank you very much, and good night. Enjoy your evening.